Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining today. My name is Kasyan Soltakevich, National Secretary of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and I'd like to welcome you all today to today's presentation with two of the authors of the Zelensky Effect, an excellent book that we will be discussing today, and there'll be some time for some Q&A as well at the end of today's presentation. So how today's format will work, I'll introduce both of our speakers here shortly and a little bit more about them. And then I encourage all of you to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will also, to encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, we'll be giving away a copy of the book today, but you do have to ask a question. So you are not allowed to just be participating. You have to actually actively participate by asking a question. So if you ask any question of any kind, well, you might necessarily get time to it, but if you ask a question, you have a chance to win a copy of today's book as well. So first, like I said, I'll introduce our two speakers. First, Dr. Olga, Onuch, who holds a doctorate from Oxford. She's a senior lecturer, associate professor in politics at the University of Manchester. In 2021, she was visiting the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto as a senior research associate. And from 2014 to 2020, she was an associate member of Nuffield College in Oxford. Since 2017, she's also been an affiliate of, and previously in 2014, a fellow of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. In 2017, she was a visiting fellow at the Davis Center at Harvard University, and she's the winner of the 2017 Political Studies Association National Sir Bernard Crick Award for Outstanding Teaching. She's also the principal investigator of the Mobiles Project, the PI on Identity and Borders in Flux, Ukraine, and is a co-PI of Data for Ukraine, and is also the 2022 chair of the selection committee for the Davis Center Book Prize in Political Science and Social Studies from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So Dr. Onuch, welcome today. And Dr. Henry Hale is the professor of political science and international affairs and co-director of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, also known as the PONARS Eurasia. His work has won 2 prizes from the American Political Science Association, has been funded by the National Science Foundation, and has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including the American Political Science Review. He has spent extensive time conducting field research in post-Soviet Eurasia, and most recent books include today's topic, The Zelensky Effect, and Paternal Politics, Eurasian Regime Dynamics and Comparative Perspective. Prior to joining George Washington University, he taught at Indiana University, the European University in St. Petersburg, Russia, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And he's also the chair of the editorial board of Demokratizatsiya, the Journal of Post-Soviet Democratization. So I welcome both Dr. Onuch and Dr. Hale to today for today's presentation, and I'll hand it off to the both of you to take it away.
Thank you very much, Kasyan. I just noticed I didn't need to unmute myself. And it's a pleasure for Henry and I to be joining you all today. Of course, both of us have a long history working and living in North America. And for me, it's a particular thrill to be speaking to my Ukrainian community in Canada, in part where I was raised. So many of you are in part also responsible for the Zelensky effect, whether you like it or not, by the community support that I received through many years. But let me jump right into the presentation. So I'm just going to flip on my, and you all see this. We're going to go with that iconic image of President Zelensky in the very early days of Russia's all-out invasion following February 24th, 2022. And of course, these images, these videos recorded under conditions where his life was in danger really had an incredible effect on us, on the world, and of course, on Ukrainians at home. So fearless, earnest, Russian target number 1, the man in the green t-shirt or sweatshirt, as may be the case in this photo. As Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine unfolds in real time on screens worldwide, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, captures the global imagination like no one else. Just 3 years prior, Zelensky was still just a television star whose main qualifications, it seemed, was having played a president on TV. The Kremlin saw him as a pushover, and certainly even his opponents tried to brand him as such. Rarely has a politician so visibly surprised so many. Yet, the full-on Ukrainian mobilization and Zelensky's potential to rally it in Ukraine should have been no surprise to any observer of Ukrainian politics and society. The reason for his success is not that Zelensky had special leadership traits that set him apart from his country, although perhaps some special leadership traits were there. Instead, what makes him extraordinary in wartime comes from his very ordinariness as an Ukrainian. He inherits a tradition of dissent and fierce civic sense of the country's identity baked into his upbringing. He is this Ukrainian every person that so few could be. And the first thing to know is that Ukraine has a long history of civic resistance. Ukrainians have repeatedly taken to the street to struggle for their rights, and Zelensky was nurtured and raised in exactly that history. In fact, Zelensky knew all these things about Ukrainians. He knew who he was rallying, and he knew how to rally them. He knew that civic identity amongst Ukrainians has always been very high and prominent and growing from the 1990s onwards, which is that last final right-hand set of bars here on your screen. In fact, in the early 1990s, we saw very large moves from people declaring Ukrainian as their nationality, specifically in Russophone, Eastern, Central Ukrainian regions and cities. It is the Russophone Eastern Ukrainian, Southeastern Ukrainian localities that saw the largest moves to declaration of Ukrainian national identity in the very early years of the 1990s. Of course, Zelensky knew this, as did he know that the history of dissent and dissidentism in Ukraine was not simply a Western Ukrainian phenomenon, but it was a phenomenon that was experienced throughout all of Ukraine. In fact, as this map shows, some of the most prominent Ukrainian dissidents came from the southeast of the country and from the center. He was also raised, of course, in that history of civic engagement and revolt against the political elite. And some people might think of the independence generation as these folks here sitting on the Maidan as part of the Revolucja na Graniti, the revolution on the granite. But we're talking about a slightly different generation of youngsters just like Zelensky himself, people who are now today in their 40s, so also people like myself inclusive, who are about 7 to 16 years of age in 1991. They had a living memory of what it meant to live under Soviet repression and communism. They remember maybe perhaps that revolution on the granite, and they certainly remember those first years of the wild, wild East that ensued. They remember the patronal politics as they developed. Zelensky will also remember, of course, the rise of that older generation of oligarchs and powerful political elite that controlled not only the economy, but also the politics of the country. He will have remembered, just like his generation will remember, the deals that were made about Ukrainians' borders, about Ukrainians' nuclear arms, about Ukraine's entry into the EU. And of course, this independence generation will remember the beheading of Hrihori Gongadze. They were already teens, early 20s at the time. This will have featured very strongly in their memories. They also remember that after the Orange Revolution, where some of them rallied around the flag quite significantly, although Zelensky not quite yet, we're talking about some of the activists of the Orange Revolution, they'll remember that after that euphoria on the streets came a sense of disappointment when, again, oligarchic politics came into the fold and politicians focused seemingly on fighting between each other instead of proposing new reforms in policy. Then comes another moment of euphoria. And this time it is the moment where the generation, independence generation, becomes the central actor of engagement. And Zelensky, in fact, is involved in some of these protests. Not often talked about, we know for certain incognito, but we know that him and his Kvartal 95 crew, that they did in fact participate in these events. And these themes that are nurtured on the Maidan also start featuring very heavily in his political theater, political satire, and then in, of course, the Servant of the People show. But Zelensky and his generation know that they are not the first and the only generation to rise up. They know that they are part of a long-standing multi-generational community that keeps rallying around the civic state. He will also remember that after the Euromaidan, after the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war, in fact, poverty was on the rise in 2015 and hit some of the highest rates in Ukrainian history. And why do we know this? Why are we so certain that Zelensky knows this? Because he tells this to us. Henry and I did a detailed content analysis and some discourse analysis of his speeches pre-wartime as president, pre-February all-out invasion, February 24th, and post-February 24th of last year. We also did a content analysis of his theatrical appearances, the songs, the shows, the political satire news show, and of course, Servant of the People. And it is these themes that keep repeating themselves time and time again, be it in his speeches or in his appearances. They focus on civic duty. They focus on ordinary citizens' role in the democratization of Ukraine, in the deepening of democracy, and repeatedly focusing on the idea that that which may divide Ukrainians, that which may be the diversity of Ukrainians, their views, their linguistic practices, their religious beliefs, is not anywhere near as strong enough as that which unites them, their civic identity, their rallying around the civic state. So when the war starts, it's not a surprise that these themes continue in his speeches. So of course, we do this very in a detailed fashion in the book, but it surprised some other observers of Ukraine, perhaps some of those 25%ers, so-called, who voted for Poroshenko instead in the second round. But these themes were not new. Neither was his, actually, the tactic or the modus operandi of some of those speeches. So when we see Ukrainians trying to move those move those tanks with their tractors, or try to stop tanks with their bare hands, it is not a surprise to Ukrainians. It is not a surprise to Zelensky, even if it might be a surprise to the rest of the world, or some in the rest of the world. In fact, as we report in the book, about 80% of the civilian population are involved in the war effort in some way, and they do so through a variety of means. Here, some depicted in this graph, but also, as we write in the book, they want to note exactly what they did. And one elderly person noted in the survey, in the other option, that they milked the goatlings to provide a high protein value milk to the ZSU. It is these actions that then give more support to both Zelensky, the army, and the Ukrainian society. Civic duty rises over this time, but also it rises up until 2022. Most folks weren't paying attention to what was happening in Ukraine 2019 to 2022. We talk about that in the book. We show how Zelensky was able to bring more Ukrainians, specifically those from Russophones from the Southeast, to pro-democratic positions, to a stronger sense of civic identity, and also to Euro-Atlanticist positions. And we tried to identify the blue arrow where the Zelensky effect started to occur, as it were, and where the wartime rally effect starts to happen in 2022. Now, this is the Zelensky effect in a very crunched down summary. But what I want you all to remember, the Zelensky effect is two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, it is the effect of the civic nation that creates Zelensky, that makes Zelensky the man and leader he is today. On the flip side, it is the very real effect of Zelensky's leadership and his discourse of civic unity that brings on specific constituencies of Ukrainians to pro-democracy, Euro-Atlanticist positions. And of course, these were the people directly on the front lines. And that fact that they became more democratic, more Euro-Atlanticist between 2019 and 2022 is incredibly important, and certainly a major element in the potential of Ukraine's victory in this war of aggression by Russia. So Henry, I pass it on to you now.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So what I'll just talk a little bit about is how we organize the book and how the book unfolds, to follow up on what Olga just said. And of course, the main organizing question of the book is why Ukraine successfully mobilized, resisted the Russian aggression, and what Zelensky's role was. And Olga has talked a lot about that. And so this has driven our choice for how to organize the book. So even though Zelensky features very prominently in the title, it's not a biography of Zelensky per se. In fact, it's much more a biography of independent Ukraine. And so we basically tried to tell the history of independent Ukraine through several lenses, through the life and development and entry into politics and actions as a politician of Zelensky himself, but also through the lens of the independence generation that Olga talked about, and also through the lens of Ukrainians as a whole, reflecting the extensive public opinion research that we've done as authors together over the years with a lot of great collaborators, and also building on a lot of other amazing research that's been done by lots of great scholars in Ukraine, working on Ukraine, that we think didn't get the attention that it deserved beforehand. So this is basically how the book unfolds. And so chapter 1 provides an overview and an introduction, kind of sets the stage, talks about the critical opening moments of the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Then chapter 2 focuses on the independence generation, and carries us basically through the Soviet period, which we treat very briefly, the acquisition of independence by Ukraine, all the way up through the Orange Revolution. Again, talking at the same time about the experiences of Zelensky himself, to the best that we can, as much as we've learned about them, the independence generation and public opinion. And that's a chapter where we also talk about the phenomenon of the dissidents that Olga mentioned, and just the tradition of resistance to authoritarian power that did develop there across different regions. Chapter 3 is called Orange is the New Corruption, and basically proceeds from the disappointment that many people felt, having devoted so much energy and given their hearts to this attempt to change the way things operate in Ukraine. And some things did change. It became much more democratic of a political system. But what we also talk about is how the revolution ultimately gave way to a lot of political infighting and a lot of policy paralysis, with the different winners of the Orange Revolution competing with each other and trying to stymie each other's moves, and ultimately giving Yanukovych, the former prime minister, who later become, he was always authoritarian in the way that he operated in government, but then later became president, basically gave him an opportunity to come back to power. And so this chapter takes us to that point, to the point at which, in basically a free and fair election in 2010, Yanukovych won the presidency again, but then quickly started backsliding, turning Ukraine away from a democratic orientation and ultimately away from its European direction, prompting this new round of mass mobilization, the Euromaidan movement. Chapter 4, then, we call The Art of Politics, art being kind of a nod to Zelensky's role in the artistic creative world. But it begins with the mass mobilization in the Euromaidan movement, and covers Zelensky's rise to political prominence, addresses the show, and many of his other creative outputs, the concerts. We do try to intersperse different quotes and use examples from his programming, not just the show, but his concerts, many skits and things, which we think are very illustrative of, among other things, his views and the messages that he is pushing. And that's one of the points that we try to make, is that, again, as Olga was talking about and alluding to, We don't think that we saw in February of last year the appearance of a new Zelensky who suddenly started doing things in a very different way and newly found himself. We find many of the most important themes, both in terms of the vision that he is articulating for Ukraine, the policies he's talking about, the way that he addresses people, the types of personal appeals that he makes, the way he's able to connect with Ukrainians, already present very far back, right? If you go back to his entertainment production, certainly there in the show. And so this actually makes the comedy material that he produced and wrote and acted in, very useful analytically for us in establishing this continuity. But also, we hope it adds some readability to the volume, because a lot of he's very good at a lot of this stuff, and so we try to integrate this into the book in various ways. And so this chapter basically takes us to his rise in political prominence up to the eve of his presidential campaign. And then chapter 5 talks about the presidential campaign itself of 2019, which we argue has been to a significant degree misunderstood. We'll be happy to go into the details of that should people be interested in it, but we call this chapter the virtual incumbent. Then chapter 6 addresses Zelensky's presidency. And so we go through and evaluate things he did, things he tried to do, things he didn't do, what he was able to accomplish, what he wasn't able to accomplish, why, his complex relationships with oligarchs and other political forces in Ukraine. And the balance sheet is complicated for any president, and we point out there are ups and downs there. But in comparison with past Ukrainian presidents, we find that he actually does fairly well. He actually has a pretty good record, despite having been new to the world of administrative politics. So even though his popularity was going down and had gone down between when he was elected and into 3 years, the third year of his presidency before the all-out invasion began, pretty much all presidents of Ukraine had their popularity go down. And we find that Zelensky's decline was actually substantially less, despite the fact that he had to deal with COVID-19 as a pandemic and all the economic and cultural and health disruptions that caused. So again, like with any president, it's going to be somewhat of a mixed record, but we actually find he did quite well compared to others. And we also try to make the point about him in the book that a lot has been made of this idea that, well, he was just a comedian, like a complete novice to politics coming into the presidency. And we argue that, in fact, that's quite a bit of an exaggeration, that he actually had quite a bit of experience, for example, as general producer for Inter, which at the time was Ukraine's largest, most popular television station. And this was a time when it was headed by an oligarch in Ukraine and under the Yanukovych administration. And this is a highly, highly political job. And we discuss how he tried to navigate that, at least as best as we can unpack. A lot of this is sort of, behind closed doors, of course. But at a minimum, what it meant is, this is not some person who's completely green, right? He's not completely new to politics. And he actually had a lot of experience and had an interest in politics from the beginning, originally as a kid wanting to be a diplomat, studying English in college, studying law and economy. So he's not as new to political affairs, and certainly not thinking about politics as is often discussed. And so, we try to talk about this in the chapters that deal with his life and upbringing and emergence into politics. But as far as the presidency, we find that, in fact, he did fairly well. And chapter 7 talks about him and Ukraine at war. And chapter 8 wraps up by thinking about, as is reflected in the title, we call the chapter Ukraine's Future History, which reflects another very interesting theme in a lot of his production, as well as his speeches as president, as candidate, which is a great attention to history. And he's often making reference to historical figures of various kinds, different historians. Servant of the People makes this point, right, as the main character, the accidental president, is a history teacher. And this is not coincidental. And so we talk about that in this chapter, and then go on to reflect about some of the challenges that are likely to face Ukraine after, what we certainly hope is a victory. And, we think that on one hand, victory will brings Ukraine a lot of hope. not just for defeating the Russians, of course, but by offering an opportunity that someone in the position that Zelensky is, with the background that he has, with the credibility that he potentially has on issues like fighting corruption and his vision for Ukraine, and especially as it's been steeled and shaped by the war effort, he has a real chance of helping take Ukraine in a democratic direction. But at the same time, I mean, there are real concerns. War can do things to a country. Even when a country is sort of just the innocent victim of a massive attack and has to mobilize to fight itself. There's certainly illiberal strains in certain parts of these politics, and the risk that things could go in a very different type of direction, both on one hand, if other political forces take power, but also if Zelensky takes a certain direction, right? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, is the way the saying goes. He has a lot of power now as head of state, a lot of popularity, a lot of support. So, there's a danger that depending on how things go, if he doesn't kind of stick true to the vision that he's at least articulated publicly, that we could see some negative developments in Ukraine. But on the other hand, I think Ukraine, we talk about in the book, has a lot of structural conditions that make the authoritarian drive, certainly from the part of Zelensky, less likely. And one is that, we find that kind of below the surface, not everybody's completely enamored with Zelensky. And I think this is probably obvious to people who have ties there, right? People are uniting around him for the war effort and generally think he's doing a good job in war. But a lot of people think that, well, at a minimum, he's probably not the right person to move things forward. And a lot of people have harbored suspicions and doubts about him from the beginning, and only kind of grudgingly have accepted his wartime leadership role as a necessity. And so, we think that should he move in a more authoritarian direction, there are going to be plenty of people there ready to mobilize against him, apart from, which is another important factor, a growing support for democracy in Ukraine as an outcome, which we also find and talk about in the book, which is one positive development that we've certainly seen. So we make a lot of other points in the book. I won't go into them here because I want to leave time for question and answer, but we have some points that we like to make about rallying around the flag, about why so many predictions about what was happening were wrong, about why Putin started his operation when he did, which we think had a lot to do with developments in Ukraine, and including Zelensky himself, as well as just, we think Zelensky, his election, for example, offers up a lot of interesting lessons as a case study for how electoral politics works or can work, which may hold lessons for Ukraine's future as well, should people pay attention to them, and once attention starts to focus on domestic politics in the future. So let me just wrap up there, and thank you so much for your attention, and we look forward to the discussion that follows.
Well, Henry and Olga, thank you so much. A great overview of the book, and yeah, there's lots of other topics and points that you make throughout the book, but maybe not to discuss all of them, because we still have to encourage our listeners to also purchase the book and read it as well. So much in there as well. So much more detailed information, and it's a really good overview of Ukraine since independence, and really the kind of will go into my first question about, and you point this out very at the very beginning of the book in your introduction. You talk about the theme of the book is really what was Zelensky before he became the Zelensky that we know today, or we see today, and you say this question is central because your argument is not that the man made the country of Ukraine, but that the country, of course, made the man. And Henry, as you pointed out towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned how, I think, and myself personally, how little people know about how big of a star Zelensky really was, not only as obviously in the role that he played in servant of the people, but so much more beyond that not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia. He was a very popular person. He declined some massive opportunities in Russia for, growing his career. He believed in Ukraine. He wanted to be in Ukraine, but he was not just the fictional president and then became the real president, but he was so much more beyond that. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that and kind of that impact and how we see that today. between the two of you.
So why don't I make a start, and then Henry, you can follow up with that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I think exactly, Kasian, you hit the nail on the head there. It's one of those things that, on the one hand, Zelensky has a very ordinary median Ukrainian sort of upbringing, right? Where he lives in, his life is really confined to those blocks where he meets those lifelong friends that they struggle. And, his father in interviews says it wasn't always easy to get meat for families. So his father said that in our house, the boys, who later become central figures in Kvartal 90, they will always have meat at our house, right? And those of us who have family and friends in Ukraine, who lived in Ukraine for extended periods in the 90s, recognize these stories as real stories that were real experiences for ordinary Ukrainians. And then on the other hand, it's his rise to fame and prominence is a tricky one. As Henry highlighted, he wanted to be a diplomat. He wanted to work in international affairs in Ukraine. And he had two choices: to go to university, in fact, initially to go to university in Kiev or in Moscow, because those were the top schools for that sort of thing. He ends up staying at home, but that is an important element of the choices that people of his generation were faced with in the building of their career. And that life just takes him somewhere else where he makes this incredible career. Then he comes back to Ukraine, of course, and that story is very tricky of how he comes back to Ukraine. When exactly does that happen? We did a lot of process tracing to get at this in the book. But sometimes we still are, we're as confident as we possibly can be. But there's still sometimes not a little bit lack of clarity exactly which years he was away and came back. But we know he comes back around the Orange Revolution. He's at Odin plus Odin at the time. He quickly rises to the ranks there. He doesn't stay as just simply the director of this troupe. He becomes a producer. He creates his own media outputs, and very quickly he is recognized as a powerful, incredible manager, right? So therefore there is an actual competition for him to be producer between Odin plus Odin and Inter. That's a story that still needs to be properly written, Henry, and I feel, because we don't know the story behind it, but it must be interesting. And this guy, who is still very young at the time, right, nowhere near the fame post 2014, becomes the general producer of Inter, not the channel, the network. So it's like being the producer of Fox, the network, not the channel. This is huge. He was an incredible power player. He might downplay his involvement with oligarchs and the politics of the time, which Henry talked about. I don't believe some of that version of the history. He was a power player, and why that story isn't still told, why don't we know that? He was clearly a much more clever and capable person. And I think that might also be an interesting, complex and problematic story once we really get the details there. But nonetheless, he certainly was not a novice on the scene. And what Henry always says in his presentation, but he didn't say this time. So Henry, I hope you don't mind. I'll say it. In fact, Poroshenko asks Zelensky to be part of his party and to be on his ticket, right? No, and there's other stories of what he was offered politically, right? And so Henry, I'm going to pass it on to you maybe to take the baton forward and what you wanted to add. But he was a power player before he became just a comedian challenging Poroshenko.
Yeah, I would just add to that, kind of a lot of the traits that come out from this earlier period, right, that we can tell the way people comment on it, the way he talks about it, is, this is also somebody who's like highly energetic, able to take on like a lot of different tasks that are required with a big job, able to manage relations with powerful people that are clearly very challenging in their own ways. He describes himself as a coffee maniac. So, he kind of bristles when people just label him a comedian, right? I mean, he'd sometimes ironically refer to himself as a clown. But there's one kind of famous interview where the interviewer basically says, "Oh, it's 11 o'clock for our interview. That's pretty early for an actor, isn't it?" And he kind of, makes clear, okay, well, I'm not just an actor, right? I'm a big time producer. And for me, it's very, very late because I'm up the crack of dawn doing X, Y, Z, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think these are a lot of the traits that came through. And his political star had already risen as a satirist through a lot of his production, but also probably because people knew him through his managerial capacities. And that led to the Poroshenko's team inviting him to have one of the top spots on his party list in 2014, and Zelensky declined. And he was also approached by others later on about taking a by-election seat in the parliament. And reportedly, they had even proposed to him that this might be a stepping stone to the presidency. And this was already, I think, back in 2012, if memory serves. So, the idea of him entering politics was not something that just appeared out of the blue, not something that just kind of mysteriously happened in the fall of 2018 when his name was bandied around as a candidate. He clearly had to have been thinking about this. And the fact that the show appeared after these ideas probably had already been mooted to him is food for thought, right? But it also suggests somebody who is very canny, very public relations savvy. And if it was something that was planned from the beginning, as this might be a way to rise to the presidency, it was very, very smart. And at the time as well, during this time prior to his election, that was kind of one of the talk of the town was about the need for new faces in politics. So that was one of the reasons he was approached. The fact that people were tired of the same old faces and things weren't getting done. And part of his appeal, we argue, was his it was partly him, but also this vision that he articulated about a civic vision of Ukraine that didn't depend on specifically any particular language or any particular culture, but that a notion of Ukrainianness, an attachment to Ukraine, the loyalty to Ukraine that was grounded first and foremost in common experiences as Ukrainian and identification with Ukraine as a country, with Ukraine as a state. And that's something that just resonated very, very powerfully and has continued through the war. And maybe just at the very last thing I'll say is just, of course, there have been some changes once he, certainly became president, but, entered the war, right? I mean, in the wartime, there's less humor. There's maybe more traditional masculinity the way that it seems to be performed, whereas before there would be a lot more kind of self-deprecating, kind of mocking of himself, it's just part of his charm, part of his appeal. And of course, a lot less naivete about Russia. But that had already changed pretty quickly. His campaign in 2019, was about, the need to, let's just sit down and talk. We can resolve things with Putin. But already by late 2019 and 2020, it's quite clear he realized who he was dealing with and had started to, move things in a very different direction as it's reflected in his rhetoric. But, certainly the rhetoric that he uses now to talk about Russia is very, very different. So in any case, we could talk a lot more about Zelensky and his rise, but that's what we have for now.
Fair enough. So I encourage everyone, just as a reminder, you can use the Q&A or the chat at the bottom. A reminder to ask your questions. Please type them in, and we'll, as some of those are coming in, we'll get to those in a second. So please remember to send in your questions, and you can get a copy of this book as well. If you do ask a question, we can enter you in. I wanted to talk maybe to the next question, something we really talk about currently, not only about Ukraine, but in society in general, is the importance of history, of course. And, we talk about, you mentioned in the book that understanding Ukraine, its history, culture, and society is vital to understanding of contemporary Europe and beyond. So we know that history is very important. And, obviously, I think all of us would agree that people don't study history enough or understand how much history has an impact on present day. But I wanted to read a quote and then ask a question kind of about the quotes used in the book. So Vasyl Holoborodko, before he's president and servant of the people, he says, mathematics is valued as a science. That's all very fine, but history, as you said, is dog shit. Then we wonder why our politicians make the same mistakes when they enter the halls of power. because they're great mathematicians. All they know is how to divide and subtract. That's all. And I tell you this as a teacher of history. I think it's a very, a very poignant quote that he says. And then I wanted to, about history and how important it is. But my question is about the quotes actually used in the book. And he has all these such strong things that he uses, not only, of course, in the show before he's a fictional president, or real fiction, and then he becomes a fictional president. But then when he becomes a real president, he has, I think his TV show quotes translate into real life quotes, and he starts just kind of using that in everyday life. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that, especially after the full-scale invasion started last year, do you think that Zelensky finally thought, I'm not going to hold back anything anymore, any of my quotes, anything I say, I have nothing to lose. Like, here I am, the world is watching me. And his more of his TV persona came out. Some of it came out obviously after he was elected, but even more of it came out after the full-scale invasion. He went, I got nothing to hold back. I'm going to go full bore on what I really believe. And kind of he realized his dream of being just so blunt with his country and his people.
That's a really interesting proposition. I'm glad you liked the quotes, because it was very difficult to convince our publisher to allow us to have so many quotes throughout the book. And for those who haven't had a chance to read the book, we not only provide quotes from the show and the theatrical performances and Zelensky's real speeches as president, we also, every single chapter starts off with a song that we do have a Spotify playlist, and these are contemporary Ukrainian songs, because we did want to do, this book is a history book in part itself, right? So we are it's an homage to Holoborodko and to Zelensky, who is really into history. We know this from speaking with people from his administration. We know that the guy is really into history. So this is not something that is invented for him by someone else. In fact, this is a personal interest of his. And also the book is mapped out with a quote of a poem by Lina Kostenko, who he uses in a speech. And so it is so cool always to me as a nerdy scholar that these quotes that are said by Zelensky himself allow us to talk about Lina Kostenko, to include songs, to include historical figures, to talk about the real Holoborodko, who is an incredible poet and dissident, to talk about Ivan Zuba, to use Lina Kostenko's words. As a political scientist and nerd, I don't know if, Henry, you ever thought you would be able to do all that in a book, but I definitely didn't. And I love the fact that his words gave me the opportunity to do it, and do it rigorously and driven by the data, right? But in terms of what you're saying, I don't know. I don't think we really see. We would have to do another analysis, but in the analysis we did, we don't see a huge step change in a lot of the language. Of course, the tone around the war is different, but in terms of the themes and in terms how he stresses certain themes, I don't think it's that dramatic of a change. That quote that you just said and that repeated throughout the show, the oligarchs that are in politics, that they are interested more in dividing society than uniting it, or doing the right mathematics to get voted in rather than actually caring about ethno-linguistic policy, right? That they used identity politics repeatedly to shore up certain types of support in elections and then let it go when it came to them being in the presidency, or when their presidency is flailing, double down on it, right? Another theme in the show, but also in his presidential speeches and today, is that of the duty of ordinary citizens. And here Henry has a great story about this. The fact that ordinary citizens are complicit in everyday corruption, that they contribute to the illiberal processes and trends in society, and that it is their duty to behave differently, which is a very strong thing to say. Rather, most, populists, everyone thinks of Zelensky, well, not everyone, we don't. A lot of people think of Zelensky as a populist, but populists don't criticize ordinary citizens and identify their faults or their contribution to the process of corruption. And so here, maybe I'll pass it on to Henry, because I think he always has this great example of that.
Yeah, I think that is one of the interesting things about his message. And I think the example that Olga is talking about is an episode that appears in the first season of Servant of the People, where as the newly elected, kind of by chance, president, Oligarchs, he kind of breaks out into this speech at a press conference where he talks about, how come corruption keeps plaguing Ukraine, and how it in fact starts in the maternity ward, when mothers come in and their families have to pay off the doctor or give them some kind of gift to make sure they get adequate care. And so right from the moment of birth, kids are kind of born into the system by necessity. And so, kind of what he's making the point, among other things, is that just by participating in these things, which is difficult for ordinary people. I mean, that's one theme that comes out clearly in the show and in some of his comedy productions, is that people are put in positions where they feel they have to engage in this behavior, or forego some tremendous risk or possibly death, or you need a doctor. When you're giving birth, you need care, or other forms of medical treatment. But the perception just is that, well, that's the way things are, unfortunately, and so we have to do it. So it's kind of this reluctant behavior. At the same time that the show's full of these instances of people who just kind of happen into some kind of situation where they can accept a payoff. And they often refer to it as like a lottery ticket, that you just happen to win a lottery ticket and everybody else is doing it. If we don't take this chance, we're going to be mired in poverty forever. And or our life plans are going to be, disrupted or impossible. And so, we have to take advantage of this now that it's happened, just because this is the way things are. Nobody supports the system. Everybody would like something better, but it's just the system. But it's this complicity of ordinary citizens that helps sustain it and helps ultimately the rich and the elites, stay in charge and profit from it and get their way in politics. And that's, a key part of what his message was, through his entertainment programming, but also in his campaign and the presidency, which has been, it is quite remarkable for the reasons that Olga suggested. And I think one thing that the show does that's kind of interesting here in terms of what, going back to your question, is that, the show, the third season of it aired during the presidential campaign itself, in the month or two leading up to the election. So this was clearly part of his opportunity to present how he would be as president, to convey what kind of president he would be. Of course, everybody understood there's a comedy, right? It's grossly oversimplified. It's not reality, but the basic ideas of how a president should and would perform are presented there, along with the idea that, well, people who are truly reformists are going to make mistakes. They're going to step on toes. They don't expect, they're going to run into backlashes. They might fail periodically, but they're going to come back and they're going to try to do what's right. So he's also, interestingly enough, kind of priming people in the show for the idea that he would make mistakes as a president, which he did, right? But that he would ultimately do the right thing. And so it is very interesting in that respect. And so I think it's not surprising that, once he becomes president and in the war, he'd be behaving a lot like he did in the show. And, he said about the show that, on one hand, Oligarchs, his character, is fictional. He said his words are mine, right? Meaning that he actually literally co-wrote them, or at least approved the scripts as part of the process, but also that clearly that this was something that reflected his vision for, what a presidency should be about, or what a president should do, how they should operate things, all the foibles and comedic tropes notwithstanding.
And I think it's interesting, absolutely. In the season 3, as it's leading up, it's kind of like as if we were watching The West Wing and seeing Martin Sheen as President Josiah Bartlett, kind of able to, if he was running for president, you would be able to see, kind of anticipate what would be happening. Although obviously it didn't happen, but he would have been a great president, but a fictional one nonetheless. Talking about your oligarchs and distrust of politicians, so Anna asks, Ukraine obviously has a history of political corruption. It's no secret that there's a high distrust of politicians. So how do you think that this will have an impact on the eventual transition of power from Zelensky to the next leader of the nation?
Shall I start, or would you?
Yeah,
like
go ahead.
I think that's an excellent question. for several reasons. And I think most of this, Henry is the patronalism guy, and this is something that he's been studying, the networks that powerful elite actors may create and how they shift and shape politics in Ukraine and elsewhere. But I think when it comes to oligarchization of Ukraine, it's a process that is both, it was a double-edged sword in a sense for Ukraine. On the one hand, the multiple oligarchic competition made it difficult for any one individual to centralize power truly, right? So one of the big things about Kuchma was that he was this manager of oligarchs, right? And that he was very skilled at trying to bring them together. And that's very much depicted in some of the, actually in the Sluha Narodu, but also in other theatrical performances, and criticized because whilst these oligarchs that are in fact politicians, including the predecessor to President Zelensky, Petro Poroshenko, we need to understand him as an oligarch, as that, he is one of the wealthiest people in the country, and he did not give up that wealth. He did not become transparent about a lot of it. And he did allow his family members to come into his party and all the sorts of things that we did not want to happen after the Euromaidan, right? That is important. And I guess all those issues around oligarchs, not only are they, that is central to Zelensky's mission, I think. I think his mission was to de-oligarchize, I don't know, oligarchization, but anyways, to get rid of oligarchs in Ukraine. And certainly we're seeing him do that, right? As much as he can in certain policies and reforms. Is that truly possible? Will it be replaced by a new wave of ultra wealthy people? Will they simply not be in parliament themselves, but still players in the background, right? Will this de-oligarchization process also be illiberal in how it occurs? In some cases, people are saying it has been, in fact. Perhaps too centralized, too swift, too much connected to the president and his administration. All these questions are important. What I think, where I would like to end, and before I pass it on to Henry, is that the oligarchs have already slightly changed over time. Prior to even 2019, they certainly have changed since 2019, and many of them have changed, I think, rather dramatically in their dealings and how they relate to the state, to the government, and to Ukrainian society. Since the all-out war began. I don't think characters like Akhmetov or Pinchuk or Poroshenko or others were folks that did not support Ukrainian statehood. They just wanted to be the managers of it and reap the benefits of that management. I think they're realizing that time in history is no longer. They have certainly supported the state. How the last phase or the next phase is, I'm sure it's not more than one, of de-oligarchization will take place. That will be a question. It has to happen in a liberal fashion. It has to happen through consensus, political consensus. Civil society has to be involved, and it can't seem like an attack on opponents, but protection of one's own network. So Henry, sorry, I spoke a little too long maybe.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I guess just what I would just add is kind of thinking big picture. One reason that corruption is so hard to root out is precisely because it's so embedded, but not really so much embedded in the sense of like in policies or institutions, but it's embedded in the mindset that this is just how things get done and that everybody else does it and that that's what we expect everybody else to do, because that's what forces everybody, or at least makes people feel like they have to engage in it themselves. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so, the key is, when can these expectations about the future change? And revolutions offer one such moment when change is possible. And that's one reason I think that, when we see like mass uprisings, right, like in the Orange Revolution or the Euromaidan movement, people are behaving in very different ways, right? They're not behaving for personal gain, right? They're not paid off. They're mobilizing for what they see as the civic good, and they're going out there, voluntarily, and it creates this sense of euphoria because other people see this and they see, wow, this is amazing. Our society, we can operate differently. we can do something very different. But the problem is that it takes something at the result of that, somebody at the top to capitalize on that movement in the sense to make it permanent. Because the big problem has been that politicians who have been brought to power in these revolutions have generally been creatures of the old system who are comfortable with the old ways and aren't comfortable with completely getting rid of it. Or they think that, well, we have to go gradually, or maybe they decide that in the end, I think the temptation, personally, I just think the temptation is often too great for leaders who might think it's the right thing, but they think, well, there's so many things I want to get done, even if you're very charitable about their intentions, right? That we have to push them through, and these old methods are just the best way to push through the needed reforms. But the problem is that just recreates the old system, and the foundations of it don't change. And the war offers, for all the destruction it's caused, offers an opportunity for a change again, because with this mass mobilization that has successfully resisted Russia in such a powerful way, it's been similar and even much greater so that people have seen how so many other Ukrainians, like the vast majority, are mobilizing for the national defense in a very selfless way. And so there is this new sense that things can happen in a different way. So a lot will depend on what Zelensky does after the war. Is he going to say, in the case of victory, kind of really use the moment to dramatically make clear that the old ways are no longer going to be tolerated. People who behave in these ways are going to be punished, and to just shift expectations in a much broader way and get rid of this sense of, well, that's just how things get done. I have no choice. The risk is, of course, that he won't do that, that either he won't be decisive about it, that he'll try to pursue a gradual approach that will compromise too much with these actors and elite actors, maybe not the oligarchs, but others who are kind of too steeped in the old processes, or that he will come to use these mechanisms for his own benefit. Or, as Olga mentioned, there's a possibility you can also be a dictator without being particularly corrupt. So there's always the risk that a lot of the measures he's used against the oligarchs, for example, if they're not involving due process, if they aren't based in institutions and the rule of law, if they involve too much presidential discretion, bypassing judiciary, things like that, that this could set Ukraine off on a non-democratic path in a different way, even though corruption may be lessened. And so again, there are a lot of questions left, but at a minimum, I think that there is a big opportunity that Ukraine will have in the case of victory for really pushing itself off in a much more positive direction, right? And we just hope that that's what happens, but it's still yet to be seen or determined.
So maybe just a short follow-up to that in terms of the oligarchs. How kind of their role about moving forward. So, we're talking about corruption, of course, but maybe oligarchs. Oligarchs is a very strong term that's very, used a lot of Eastern Europe or in dictatorship or authoritarian regimes. But here we just call them billionaires. Like, they don't have that direct political power. They have indirect, through lobbying and through think tanks and whatever else. But do you think that there's the potential of that I don't think anyone's expecting all these, the billionaires in Ukraine or the oligarchs now to just all of a sudden have no money and to disappear, but perhaps their influence just changes of going, we see that Viktor Pinchuk has, conferences that he puts on about discussions and things like this, that's a transition. Do you think that maybe after the war, there would be more of that so-called normalcy of them becoming from an oligarch to just a billionaire of, it's normal for them to be sailing on a yacht and you have a huge corporation and all that's understandable, but that transition of oligarchy to just billionaire.
Just billionaire.
Yeah. Well, rich person.
We all just be billionaires at some point. And full disclosure, I attended the Yes conference that Pinchuk has thrown multiple years running now. So, and I actually found it always to be very interesting and stimulating. But the wealth in itself, may be problematic in itself, depending where you land in your own how you view the world. Extreme wealth is problematic, I think. Will wealthy people exist? Certainly. Should they? Okay. I don't have a personal normative view on that. It's what they're, it's not about, and we have these problems obviously in North America, we have these problems elsewhere in Europe and around the world, certainly in the other region I study in Latin America. They're not called oligarchs all the time, but there are very wealthy individuals who then control either the media or key industry or directly or indirectly policy through being members of parliaments or senates or legislatures or managing actors. And that's, I think, the problem is and has been to this day in Ukraine, where these weren't simply wealthy people that were influencing through various means. They were directly managing politics. In fact, they were the prime minister, the president, and so on in cases. And so, you know, we often talk about the Firtashes, the Pinchuks, the Akhmetovs, and name more if you would like. But this is where I think the question is about the Tymoshenkos or the Poroshenkos that are in power, that are not even, they're not even pretending to simply manipulate politicians. They are the politician. That is a tricky thing, right? Poroshenko is an incredibly important reformer. We write about that in the book. We think some of the most important reforms that occurred since 2014 are, you know, in part thanks to him and his team and his party and a lot of the young Euro-Atlanticist focused folks and pro-decentralization folks that he had in his party. Is it problematic that his, you know, more chocolate stores opened up during his presidency? Is it problematic that he went back into parliament afterwards as being a multi-billionaire? Those are questions for political scientists as indeed problematic. And so it's not about wealth or wealthy individuals, it's what role they play in the machinations of politics. And can you get through politics without their machinations influencing you or having to be in opposition to them, right? And that has been the story of Ukraine so far. I think some have moved away more. Others have just decided to support, you know, scholarships and other things where they bring people onto their side. I would like to see less. I would generally not like to see billionaire presidents in the future of Ukraine. I think that's problematic. I think that's it. I think I'll let it's problematic to say.
Probably not only from Ukraine, but for other countries as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Henry, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just, you know, especially when so many people have been so poor, right? I think the key is to raise everybody up. But yeah, I agree with what Olga said.
Great. So I know we still have maybe a couple more minutes for a few last questions. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write to them into the Q&A or into the chat function. We still have a few minutes for maybe one or two more, but I want to read one thank you from Oksana, who said, I saw the Servant of the People series and relate to the characters from my upbringing in Canada and the Ukrainian community. It was obvious that he was drawing on history in the program. I didn't know much more about Mr. Zelensky than what was in the media at the time, and your analyses today brought everything I know about the period he grew up in full circle, so thank you very much for that. So that was a thank you from Oksana. Now I wanted to go to Sarah for her question, maybe more about Zelensky's history in his past, and she was asking, how do you think Zelensky's parents and grandparents, and especially his grandfather, affected his strong character that we see today?
That's an interesting question. We have limited data on that. And, you know, Henry and I are proper nerds in that we really are driven by the data we have and what we report. And I mean, to be perfectly frank, there are things we discussed that didn't make the book because we weren't quite certain we had the empirical evidence to back it up. But what we do know is that his relationship to his parents has been very strong. He has been influenced by their journey as ordinary Ukrainians, even if professors and scientists, not necessarily as those who know Ukrainian context very well, will know that just because somebody was a university professor, that didn't mean they had a very good, very high quality of life necessarily. And I think what's interesting is the frankness that he talks about his parents, in that, you know, they were from Dnipro, so the so-called blue party, the party of regions, was their party. was the party that said that was representing them. And they did vote for these parties in the past, but that was more of a regional identity element and not so much a civic Ukrainian aspect. And so, of course, when Yanukovych, it was very clear that he is an all-out authoritarian, that they also switch sides, right, to the pro-European side, something like this. So I think that very typical experience politically and socially of his parents did certainly influence him. On the grandparents, we know a little bit, and we mentioned that a tiny little bit in the book. But Henry, I don't know if there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess, we do know, right? He had one grandparent, maybe that was the reference of the question, who was the only survivor of the Holocaust in his family, right? And so, this is something that he doesn't talk about a whole lot, at least not in the public record that we could find. Unfortunately, we didn't have the opportunity to interview him about a lot of these things like we would like to have, maybe a follow-up sometime. I think we figure that it can't not have affected him in some way. He clearly knows about this, and it must have been passed along. So at a minimum, it just makes it ridiculous. For all the other reasons, it's ridiculous to call him a Nazi, right, in power in Kiev, as the Kremlin rhetoric has it. But clearly it must have influenced him somehow. And my guess would be that it is one of the things that drives him away from authoritarian forms of government. But again, that's pure speculation. But I think it's a very interesting topic for future, research and biographical studies.
But one thing that I'd like to add in the way where he does talk about his upbringing and his family members, and at times his Jewish descent is more often how it's described, right? He talks about the struggle of decent people in the 90s and early 2000s, right? That's a theme, obviously, in all the theatrical performances of the show. It's a theme in many of his speeches. But the struggle of decent people trying to do the right thing, right? And I think when he references his upbringing, his parents, it is this story of them trying to do the right thing, like and in very difficult circumstances, where buying meat is difficult. I don't use that example loosely because I have colleagues that could only have plain pasta for the whole month because that's all that they could afford when we were coming into work, right? And those are the experiences. And that means that you're trying not to pay the bribes. You're trying not to contribute to the bad system. You're trying to pay your taxes more or whatever. And maybe that, if I may, that experience of at least seeing his parents as decent people trying to do the right thing maybe influenced him in the way he sees civic duty in Ukraine.
Thanks. So we'll have maybe, I think we have time for one more, maybe a quick second one as well. But the next question from Anne asking, there are millions of Ukrainians obviously who left Ukraine because of the war. Any thoughts or ideas on how Zelensky feels he is perceived by them, and how he can maintain his link with those people who have fled because of the war?
Henry, do you want to start off?
Yep, that sounds like up your alley, I think so.
Right, because this is one of the things we study actually in the Mobilize project, and a lot of Mobilize project data was the basis for some of the more contemporary research we did for the book. There are different constituencies in Ukraine, and they don't necessarily change when they go abroad, right? So the people that make up the so-called 25%ers, as we refer to them throughout the book, but also as they refer to themselves as such, are people who maybe support Zelensky now because it's the right thing to do for the unity of Ukraine. They certainly see how he is portrayed internationally when they are abroad. We have some data from the UK about that. And they accept that, maybe privately don't, even strongly so, right? Some of them do, some of them don't. Then there is the broad majority that sees and admires his leadership. And not only his, but obviously other key political leaders in Ukraine today. And that hasn't changed, I think. I think from the research that myself and my colleagues have conducted in the UK over the last year, there is some evidence that also seeing how Zelensky is understood and perceived abroad actually is a source of pride for ordinary Ukrainians. And maybe the fact, because he seems so ordinary in some sense, maybe in the way he speaks also is very casual, right? He is very accessible, and I think they see themselves in that quite often. So there is some evidence that they see it as an element of pride. But we don't underestimate the fact that there are entrenched non-support, and some of it is very strong, and I think we don't have time to unpack it now in full. Some of the folks who did not support both at home and abroad Zelensky have shifted. We don't know how, and some of it it's like as Henry said, it's demonstrative, it's public, but the private shift hasn't occurred. And for some people, they have genuinely shifted in their view and support of Zelensky. Yes, I think that's yes, I think that's where I'll end that. Yeah.
I just wanted to maybe a final question before I know we're just reaching the quarter hour. So we'll finish maybe off with this last question. A simple one. We have lots of satire in Servant of the People. And growing up, I always loved watching Jon Stewart's The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. And that influenced, I know, Bassem Youssef in Egypt, who then had to flee because of corruption and autocracy in their country. So how do you think Ukrainians are in terms of satire? Do you think they're a generally satirical people, very joking people? They can kind of get that, or are they more serious? What are your kind of thoughts on the satirical part of things?
My Vujko thinks he's very funny. So how about that, right?
Does your Vujko think that he's funny or Zelensky's funny?
No, my Vujko thinks he is funny.
Oh, yes.
No, and we all have a Vujko just like that. But I think there's some of that humor in Servant of the People and in the shows was not my cup of tea at all, right? So I think the first time I watched it because I always mention this in these presentations, Natalia Gumenyuk, my friend and colleague, but this incredible Ukrainian journalist, after the first round of the presidential election in 2019 said, Olga, you're going to have to rewatch everything and you're going to have to watch every second of it. And then I did that the first time, still didn't like some of those jokes and satirical. And I think people still are turned off by some of it in some cases. But at the same time, I think it's very honest. So I don't know if Ukrainians are funny, but every Ukrainian watching, there's that scene in one of the early episodes of season 1. It's how the director of the school really scolded him and hated him in the very beginning, and how he was all flustering. And then when he becomes president, they greet him with of course, the baked bread, the bulava. They start singing a traditional song to welcome him. And that's satire, but it's funny because it's so real. We've all lived through that moment where somebody is being greeted with food and vodka and a bulava, and all like these symbolic things, and then the bowing and all that, and it's funny because that's satire, right? It works because it's based in reality. So Henry, I don't know, Henry, the non-Ukrainian, are we funny people?
Well, I'll refrain from cultural generalizations, but there's certainly a very strong tradition of humor in Ukraine. I'll say that for sure.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Maybe an interesting point to end on here is that the history of Henry, the club, right? That it's has a dissident past in history in the Soviet Union, right? And so actually, that was part of the things that were important to dissidents through humor to communicate difficult realities of repression and societal experiences.
Great. Well, we're just at the quarter hour, so I want to thank everyone for all their questions. I want to also congratulate Anna B. When we read your last name, but we will email you and I'll send you a copy of the Zelensky Effect, an excellent book and an excellent read. I want to thank Dr. Olga Onuch and Dr. Henry Hale for being here today. also for writing this excellent book. I encourage everyone to go out and buy it if you haven't read it already. Go buy it from an independent bookstore if you have to buy it from a chain, but better to buy it from an independent bookstore if you can, or from a Ukrainian bookstore. We have a couple in Canada as well. So thank you both for being here today. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us and for hopefully learning something interesting and enjoying this afternoon. And wish you all the best in the rest of your days. And thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
can I add one? I'm leaving a copy on the campus of University of Toronto for students. So if there's any students listening, if you know any university students, there will be a signed copy somewhere on the university campus that you can find. There will be a picture on my Instagram feed. So students, free book for you.
It's the best treasure hunt I've ever heard of. So thank you all. Have a great day.
All right, thanks
so much for
again.
joining. Bye-bye.